So in Genesis, we have this story of the destruction of Sodom. Now, there are a couple of things that are interesting about that. First of all, yeah, there's a description of what could well be a volcano or something that's going on, right? So how God did that, we don't know. And often people start the story of Sodom beginning at chapter 19, which is when the angels are coming into town to talk to Lot, right? But we forget that story doesn't start there. The story starts in chapter 18, okay? So the angels have come to Abraham and Sarah, and they've told Sarah she's going to have a kid when she's 90, and she's like, you're out of your mind, and laughs at them, right? And as they're walking about, as the men are getting to leave, right, something's going on there too. So Abraham's walking with them. And this begins in verse 16, chapter 18. When the men got up to leave, they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see on their way. Then the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the ways of the Lord, by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what was promised to him. Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down and see what it is they have done, and how bad the outcry has reached me. If not, I will know. So something's already going on in Sodom. The angels aren't even there yet. Okay? The men turned away and went toward Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before God. Then Abraham approached God and said, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will they really be swept away, and you not spare the place for the sake of 50 righteous people? Far be it from you to do such a thing. Abraham's a politician. To kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike? Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? God said, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake. But Abraham's not done. Then Abraham spoke again. Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city because of 5 people? See how he's turned the numbers around? If I find 45 there, God said, I will not destroy it. Once again, Abraham spoke to him, what if only 40 are found there? God said, for the sake of 40, I will not do it. Then Abraham said, may the Lord not be angry, but let me speak. What if only 30 can be found there? God answers, I will not do it if I find 30 there. Abraham said, now that I've been so bold as to speak to God, what if only 20 can be found there? God said, for the sake of 20, I will not do it. Then he said, may the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there? And God answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. When God had finished speaking with Abraham, God left, and Abraham returned home. Now this is what happens before. Sodom is so corrupt that God has decided, because God's heard this outcry, God has decided to destroy the entire city. But God will make exception if there are righteous people on the way, right? Mm-hmm. Now that's such an interesting conversation between Abraham and God. We often hear about the conversation, but we never get it linked to the larger story, which I think is part of the mistake, right? So Lot has gone to live in the city, has a wife and a couple of daughters there. Sodom's an interesting place. From what we know about it, it really was pretty rank and corrupt, okay? It's a walled city for security. And there is, at this point in time, it's really important to place scriptures in context, right? Because, you know, there's a scripture in the New Testament where Jesus says, unless you hate your mother and father, you can't serve me. Well, if we pull that sentence out of context, Jesus sounds like a scoundrel. Mm-hmm. In context, we know that's not exactly what he meant, right? So context is important. We have got to know what the words are in their context and in their historical context, right? So here's Lot living in this walled city, and it's known for being corrupt. There's a city ordinance in Sodom at this time that when you bring somebody into town, or when a stranger comes to town, the city council needs to know who they are. Now, whether that's because they want to protect the city or because they want to maybe fleece them in some way, I don't know. Right? But that's why this thing exists. It's the city council has control over who comes in and out of this gated, walled city. Okay? So these angels show up, and they just look like guys. There's no big flappy wings. And they go to Lot's house. And they tell Lot to pay attention, that something bad is going to happen. Get your wife and kids ready. And Lot says, no, come and stay in my house. Come and be with me tonight. And they're like, no, we'll go sleep in the square, just like everybody else that comes into town. And Lot is really insistent, because Lot knows how corrupt this place is and that bad things can happen to these guys, right? So he brings them in and he feeds them and he washes their feet. He's showing all the hospitality that would have been common for that time in the Mediterranean civilizations of the area. Okay? And while they're there, Scripture says that all of the men of the city, young and old, come and surround Lot's house. That's an intimidating crowd, right? And they say to Lot, who knows this is not a good thing, and they say to Lot, bring these strangers out that we may know them. Now here's a crucial piece of information, that we may know them. Okay, this particular word in the text, to know, is used hundreds of times in the Old Testament. Hundreds of times. And yet, remarkably, when we hear people talk about knowing someone biblically, they're always talking about sex. Right? Is that word mean sex all 900 times that it's used? No. Only about 10 times. Does it have anything to do with sexual relations? And to assign that to a sexual relation here, there's no really good reason for that, because it doesn't make sense in this context. And people say, oh, well, it must mean that you must know that what they want because he offers his daughters to them. Which, first of all, as a parent, I find appalling. Not offering my daughters. But there's precedence for that as well, because it does happen, actually, in another scripture, where a father offers his two daughters who are then killed and raped by the men. It doesn't happen here. The fact that he would offer his daughters, though, even if he believes that what their intent is sexual, means that he understands them to be attracted to females. Mm-hmm. Correct? Doesn't that make sense? Right? Because I'm not going to offer ham to you if you're Jewish. Okay? So if there's any sort of sexual intent behind this particular bribe, it's because he understands that they would accept this as a gift. Okay? Second thing to pay attention to here is the scripture says that all of the men of Sodom surround the house. Now, if you believe that this scripture is about homosexuality in even the vaguest way, which frankly there's nothing to say that, but if you believe that, then what on earth does the gang rape of two guys by an entire city of men have to do with gay relationships? Nothing that I can think of. It's kind of like saying those men who in the other story took the two women as the bribe and raped them until they died, that's a model of heterosexuality. No, that's about violence. Mm-hmm. That's about violence. All right? So when we read that scripture, when we read this entire passage in its context, in its historical context, linguistic context, there is no reason in the world to associate this scripture with homosexuality. It's just not there. Now here's the thing. The Bible, I think, is a pretty smart book. And I think the Bible provides some of the best commentary on itself. So let's go see what Ezekiel thought the sin of Sodom was. Let's face it, Ezekiel's much closer in time than we are. He probably had a better idea of what was going on there, right? So let's look at Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 49 through 50. So Ezekiel, this prophet, is writing to the Israelites who continually go through prophets because they keep messing up, right? And Ezekiel says to them, now this is the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore I did away with them, as you have seen. So according to Ezekiel, the Israelites are worse than Sodom. And he goes through this whole list of comparisons right, about how bad they're being. And they're worse than Sodom, but the sin of Sodom, Ezekiel, who is not that far away in time, says was pride, overfeeding, unconcerned, did not help the poor and needy. This sounds a whole lot like us today. We live in a country where we are haughty. We think we're better than everybody. American exceptionalism is somehow seen as a good thing and a real thing. We're haughty. We don't care about the poor and the needy. What do we spend our budget on?
Football.
Football. Today's
Military.
Yeah, the military. We spend more than the next 17 countries combined in military spending. If anybody's like Sodom, it's us. And here's the thing. I happen to believe, because I am a Christian, I believe that Jesus was the Son of God. I believe that Jesus is a lot smarter than us. And a lot smarter than people with a political agenda who would use the scripture to harm people. And Jesus talked about this as well. And he says to the disciples, and this is Luke 10:10, but when you enter a town and you're not welcome to go into its streets, when you're not welcome there, go into the streets and say, even the dust of your town that sticks to our feet, we wipe off against you. Yet be sure of this, the realm of God is near. I tell you, it will be more bearable on that day for Sodom than for that town. Now, Jesus has just equated the sin of Sodom with inhospitality. Okay? So remember we talked about context. So in Genesis, right, when we're reading the story of Sodom, one of the things we have to keep in mind is, what is it like? What's it like at that point in time? Well, one of the things we know was that in order for people to survive during this particular period of time in this area, they have to have hospitality from strangers, okay? Because you can't go from town to town with nothing. There's very little food, there's a little water, right? And there are a lot of bad people out there, okay? So hospitality is an enormous, enormous issue in Middle Eastern cultures, and that continues today. So for the angels to have come to town, and for the council not only to have not welcomed them, but to have threatened them, was the violation of an incredibly deep-rooted